I am the Space Quest historian. In the past, I've made a few videos about some dirty little secrets hiding in the Space Quest games, such as how to get Roger stuck on a conga line of Sariens in Space Quest 1, or what happens if you swear at the parser in Space Quest 3 25 times. But there are other neat little nuggets hiding in these games that don't really warrant a big exploration. Certainly not one I could pad out a whole video for on their own, but they are nevertheless fun little bits of trivia that I think deserves a bit of attention. So here, in no particular order, are 11 things you probably didn't know about Space Quest. Why 11? Well, because I thought of an extra one, and who says you gotta have a round number anyway? Number 1. The cave squid is a lazy bastard. Space Quest 2. The Labion cave squid gave me fucking nightmares as a child. After the little pink dudes shove you into the hole with the promise of being able to escape the planet once you reach the other side of the tunnels, you find yourself engulfed in darkness with only the eerie, distant sounds of slurping and growling for company. While the game doesn't actually play these sounds for the player to hear, the mere mention that they're there is enough to send a chill down my spine even to this day, because if there's one thing I don't like, it's being trapped in a confined space in pitch black darkness while being stalked by a tentacled monster. I'm not kink shaming, it's just not my idea of a good time, okay? And as a kid, crawling through these tunnels was absolutely anxiety spiking for me, especially if I took a wrong turn and suddenly got jump scared by this little fucker. But what someone probably should have told little baby SQH is that you're actually perfectly safe in these tunnels. The squid isn't actually hunting you, it's stationary the entire time, and it never moves. Here's the layout of the maze. The squid hangs out here in this dead end. He doesn't show up immediately though. You first have to crawl into this dead end, and then when you turn around to crawl back where you came from, that's when you get squidded. But that can only happen here at this specific dead end and nowhere else in the maze. And he's actually quite far away from where you're supposed to go in order to reach the exit, so there's actually a much greater chance of you stumbling upon the exit than running into this tentacled twat. Still, if you ever did, and you were a little kid who was both afraid of the dark and squids, well, fuck this maze. Number 2. Je m'appelle Scott Murphy. Space Quest 6. On a slightly more wholesome note than getting diddled in the dark by a cephalopod, the Information Superhighway Office in Space Quest 6 has a small handful of hidden messages. One fairly well-known one involves Space Quest narrator Gary Owens having a surprisingly candid moment that probably should be archived under TMI. Now, the general look message for the area is...
You saw it here first. A preview of the famed Information Superhighway. Wow.
But if you keep clicking the look cursor on the background, by the 7th time, Gary will graciously add the following.
Wow, this makes my nipples hard.
Yeah, I'm just gonna leave you with that mental image for a while. But this isn't the only secret message in this room, however. There are actually 2 instances where you'll hear from the game's voice director yelling at either Gary or the game's co-designer Scott Murphy. These aren't really hidden as such, but they do come out of left field for what are supposed to just be straight-up look messages. If you look at the trash icon, Gary suddenly grows a conscience and references a topical court case between Apple and Microsoft, or, well, topical for 1995, only to be chastised by the game's director.
Very tidy. A trash can. That might be a perfect place to store all those vital screen-saving programs like that cool Yasser Arafat version you've downloaded from POL. Pardon me, but I'm just a little nervous about this trash can thing. Didn't someone already go to court and spend wads of buckazoids over this?
Gary! Just read the copy, for Christ's sakes. We're not paying you to think. We just want that pretty voice of yours. All right, you friggin' union geek. Okay, people. Mr. Owens has gathered himself together, and we are ready to pick it up from that oh-so-fascinating Barney Fife meets Barry Mason segue. All right. Animation to speed. And roll.
Now obviously that's not the game's actual voice director. Scott Murphy was the actual director, and the in-game director is played by William Hall, who also does Roger's voice.
I was just mumbling to myself.
But speaking of Scott, there's another kind of hidden message where we get to hear from Mr. Murphy himself. You're supposed to pick up one of these numbers here, but if you look at them before picking one up, you get this little exchange.
Numbered cyber cards hang here, chiming peacefully in the cyber breeze.
Cut! Wait a minute. What is this chiming in the cyberspace crap? Scott, get over here. Change this.
What? Frickin' director. This guy would know a good line if it climbed up his... Oh, here.
All right, that's better. Try it again, Gary.
Numbers hang here.
Okay, funny stuff, I think we can all agree. And you're probably thinking, oh, but I already knew about those because I'm a very attentive adventure game player who clicks on every hotspot like you're supposed to. And yeah, these aren't exactly well-hidden secrets or anything, but here's what you may not be aware of. Space Quest 6 was also released in Germany and France with full voiceover dubs, and you may be wondering, who did they get to play Scott Murphy? Well, Scott Murphy himself. Despite speaking neither German nor French, Scott nevertheless took it upon himself to deliver the translated lines of his little cameo. Let's have the French version first.
Scott, venez ici! Changez-moi ça!
Ah, dites encore, le metteur en scène. Ce type ne saurait pas reconnaître un bon dialogue, même si on riant. Oh, voilà.
And here's the German version.
Scott, was soll das? Ändere das sofort!
What? Regie, Heini, keine Ahnung von Kunst, verdammt. Ah, here.
Now, I don't speak German or French either, so I can't comment as to how well he got away with it, but you gotta admire the effort at least. Number 3. Skipping half of ScumSoft, Space Quest 3. Most people know about the holy shit cheat code in Space Quest 1 that lets you pick the outcome of the slot machine, or the win cheat code in Space Quest 2, which takes you to a fake win screen with 255 out of 250 points. But not many people know that you can skip half of the ScumSoft sequence in Space Quest 3 with a simple cheat command. Now, I already did a video ages ago about this cheat, but it still seems to be a fairly well-kept secret, so I think it's worth mentioning again. Once again, big up to Sam Lawson on my Discord for discovering this one. When you get to the moon of Pestulon and enter the secret headquarters of ScumSoft at the end of the game, you're meant to find a janitor's disguise in a closet and then go around the cubicles, zapping trash bins along the way. The goal here is to obtain a key card from the office of ScumSoft CEO Elmo Pug, as well as a photocopy of his portrait. These two items are located on opposite sides of the cubicles, which means you have to traverse a fair distance to get them, zapping every wastebasket you come across along the way, and if you miss a single one of them, it's an instant game over. But you can skip this entire sequence right from the start when you first enter the hallways of ScumSoft. Simply type pump shark to enable the debug mode, then type get a life. This instantly grants you the janitor's disguise, the sapper, the keycard, and the photocopied portrait, so you can proceed directly to the locked door and free the two guys from their captivity without having to zap a single wastebasket. Now obviously this doesn't give you the points you'd otherwise acquire from doing the sequence as intended, and you still have to contend with the Nukem Dukem robots fight, which can be an exercise in frustration all to itself, but it's still a massive time saver if you just want to rush to the end or if you have some sort of crippling phobia of wastebaskets. Number 4. Skipping the StarCon Aptitude Test, Space Quest 5. Speaking of skips, here's one in Space Quest 5 that surprisingly few people know about. Normally, when you go to take the StarCon aptitude test at the beginning of the game, you're supposed to look over the shoulder of the classmate sitting next to you and copy his answers onto your own test, all while evading the watchful eye of the Proctormatic 9000 anti-cheating droid. Getting any of these answers wrong, or just getting caught by the droid, results in game over. And it's a bit of a slog because there are 10 questions on this test, which means you have to repeat this little sneak peek maneuver 10 times before the test is over. But there's actually a quicker way to get past this sequence without having to bother with looking over Brady Boy's shoulder here, or even bothering getting the answers right. Simply pick the last option of every question, and Roger will pass the test. Simple as that. I think this might have been a QA feature for the testers that got left in by mistake, because it obviously doesn't make any sense in the context of the story why this would work, but it does. Obviously, this doesn't grant you the points for successfully cheating off your brainy classmate, and he doesn't even remark that he saw you peeking at his answers once the test is over, which he usually does if you do the puzzle as intended, but hey, it's better than gritting your teeth and clenching your sphincter hoping that this hovering little metal testicle doesn't catch you and start blasting his siren 10 times in a row. Number 5. Lukaszuk is not a jab at LucasArts, Space Quest 5. Sticking with Space Quest V for the moment, most of the planet names in Space Quest V are some sort of pun or reference. Clorox is the name of a disinfectant bleach, Commodore LXIV is a reference to the 8-bit computer Commodore 64, LXIV being the Roman numeral for 64, and gingivitis is the name of a real-life gum disease. Yum. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that the planet Lukaszuk 2 is a not-so-subtle jab at Sierra's rivals LucasArts, like in Lucas, as in LucasArts, and Zuck, as in they suck, right? But it's actually not. Instead, it refers to two brothers who worked at Dynamics, where Space Quest V was developed, primarily as programmers. The brothers were originally from Poland, and their last names were, well, Lukaszuk, or as it's actually pronounced, Lukaszuk. Darius Lukaszuk, aka Derek Lukaszuk, worked on a number of Dynamics' early adventure games such as Heart of Gold and Rise of the Dragon, while Piotr, aka Peter Lukaszuk, was more involved in Dynamics' simulation games like Red Baron and Aces of the Pacific. None of them actually worked on Space Quest V, but their presence at the company, along with their, for Americans at least, unusual last name, landed them a spot of immortality as a planet name in the game. Number 6. The Sarien King's Quest fan, Space Quest 1. Getting full points in Space Quest 1 is actually trickier than you might think, and it's all down to this one little Sarien twat. Once you've donned your Sarien disguise and come out of the laundry room, there's a single Sarien guard hanging out near the elevators. Talking to him produces one of many random responses. Most of them are just little quips, although two of the responses are very curiously fourth wall breaking. One of them has the guard outline his favorite massacre, the Great Daventry route, which is a bit peculiar. For those of you in the back, Daventry is the name of the kingdom in King's Quest. Another response involves Roger asking the guard if he's played King's Quest III, which the guard enthusiastically replies yes to. Okay, still a bit odd. But if you keep talking to him, he will eventually ask you if you own King's Quest II. Now, Roger doesn't say anything in reply, so you might just assume this is just another one-liner from this obviously deranged guard, but curiously, getting this particular line awards you with 1 point. And it gets worse. If you type yes straight away after being asked about your ownership of the aforementioned Sierra title, the guard will enthusiastically reply, "Great!" and the game rewards you with an additional 5 points. So that's 6 points in total you can get out of listening to the shit pipe babble on about a game you're not even playing. Now, if you're the sort of person who doesn't give a fuck about 100%ing these games, then this is all meaningless to you. But if you were a completionist back in the day, you could be spending ages trying to work out how to get those last points, and, well, turns out it was hiding behind this massive plug for King's Quest all this time. Fun side note, according to Scott Murphy, this little Easter egg was programmed into the game by Ken Williams himself, because towards the end of the game's development, Scott ended up staying over at the Williams' house to finish up the game. Scott was reportedly a bit upset at this Easter egg, not so much the fact that it's there specifically, but because Ken decided to award the player points for finding it, which Scott found to be a bit on the unfair side, and I'm inclined to agree with that. Number 7. Making the games harder to sell hint books. This one doesn't really apply to any particular Space Quest game, but really any Sierra game from this time period of roughly 1985 to 1995. There's a pervasive rumor that the game designers at Sierra were actively encouraged by management to make their games harder, so players were more likely to go out and buy hint books or call Sierra's 1-800-HINT line. And look, I hate to sound like a broken MP3 and keep harping on about this, because I've mentioned this in a couple of videos, but I still see it crop up in my comments every now and then, so it's a rumor that's still alive and well today, and I just want to take another stab at putting a cork in it, because, well, it's not true. Scott Murphy told me himself, in person, that they never, not once, were told to make their games more challenging for any reason, and certainly not because Sierra wanted to sell more hint books. The reason why you may think so is because, well, Sierra games could be pretty brutal at times. It's no secret when looking back on these games that there are some puzzles where you think, well, how the fuck was I supposed to guess that's what I had to do? The truth is, these were just puzzles that the designers at the time thought were perfectly fair and reasonable, only to find out once the games were released that people were struggling endlessly to figure them out. When you look back on these games, they're actually relatively short. Space Quests 1, 2, and 3 can be comfortably beat in less than an hour if you know exactly what you're meant to be doing, so of course the designers would put in challenging puzzles to make players feel like they got their money's worth. It wasn't like today when you have a million unplayed games in your Steam library and you just want a quick rush before moving on to the next game. If you bought a Sierra game back in the day, you expected to sink a good chunk of time into them, and that's why the designers put in a lot of head scratchers to make the games seem longer than they actually were. So no, the games weren't made especially difficult because Sierra wanted to squeeze more buckasoids out of you. They were just making puzzles they felt were challenging enough so that people wouldn't be able to finish them over a weekend and feel like they got ripped off paying full price for a game that lasted about as long as it took to spring clean your house. Also, you gotta remember, back then, there were no hard rules about how adventure game design was supposed to work. The amenities we take for granted these days, like hotspot indicators, in-game hints, and a list of objectives telling you what you need to do, weren't a thing back then. Also, if you were a game designer, you couldn't go to school and learn how to design a game. Designers of that time were just making shit up as they went along, and stuff like dead ends or game overs without try again buttons were just how things were at the time. And yes, LucasArts came along in the early 90s and made a big stink about how their games would never kill the player or put them in a dead-end situation, but that was actually a fairly ballsy and rebellious thing to do back then. We tend to forget that we take these things for granted these days when it wasn't really the norm back then. Anyway, I hope I've managed to bury that little misconception to at least some of you, so you'll stop perpetuating this myth in my comments. Cheers very much. Number 8. The Datacorder wasn't supposed to be copy protection. Space Quest 6. The Datacorder is a fairly infamous puzzle in Space Quest circles because it requires you to look up the hints on how to solve it in the game manual. Back in 1995, games on CD-ROM didn't usually have copy protection because it was assumed that players wouldn't pirate CD-ROM games, which sounds silly today, but remember, pirated games back then usually came on CD-ROMs themselves. You couldn't just upload a full CD-ROM game to the internet and expect people to sit there and download 600 megabytes because that would take all day, or several days in fact, and it would cost an arm and a leg because dial-up modems ran over your phone lines, meaning A, your phone bill would skyrocket if you were to download anything larger than a JPEG file, and 2, you couldn't use your goddamn phone while you were doing it. You gotta remember, this was back when all we had was landline phones. So if a game came out on CD-ROM back in those days, they typically wouldn't have copy protection in them because CD burners were still massively expensive, and even if the game did end up on one of those illicit pirate CD collections, it would usually be neutered by having all the speech and FMV files removed to make room for more games. So you were really getting the short end of the stick if you went with pirated CD-ROM games back in those days. So why is the solution to the Datacorder puzzle in the game's manual? Well, it's actually due to a somewhat embarrassing oversight during the game's development. It's no secret at this point that Space Quest 6 had a troubled development. In fact, this thing came out sideways. Halfway through development, the original designer Josh Mandel left the company, and Scott Murphy was put in charge of salvaging the rest of the project. Now, the Datacorder was part of Josh's original design, but the hints for how to solve it were actually supposed to be on one of the computer discs you pick up in Nigel and St. John's apartment. It was supposed to be this little comic book that was a send-up of Star Trek, but it got put on the back burner when Scott took over the project, and they never got around to actually making that comic book. A few weeks before the game was due to ship, Josh called up Scott and asked him how the game was coming along, and he specifically asked about the comic book, to which Scott replied, "Yeah, we never got around to finishing that, it didn't seem that important." And Josh was like, "What? How are people supposed to figure out the Datacorder puzzle?" And Scott replied, "Oh shit, is that what that was for?" So since the game was already finished and the deadline was right around the corner, they had no time to go back and actually do this comic book and put it in the game, so they ended up putting the hints in the manual instead. Same goes for the shuttle intermix puzzle, where you're supposed to look at the periodic table of elements and work out which 4 elements have to be cobbled together to make the shuttle work. Yeah, just a complete oversight. It was never intended as copy protection, it was just a last minute oh shit thing. Number 9. The Grace of the Warp Motivator, Space Quest 5. Okay, one more Space Quest 5 one. When you get to the end of the game and infiltrate the Goliath, you're meant to hook up the warp generator that Beatrice stole from the ship earlier, but unattentive players might potentially just walk out the door instead and proceed onwards with the game, which would leave them in a bit of a spot because you end up setting your own ship to self-destruct and you have to warp away in the Goliath to escape the explosion. Pretty hard to do without warp speed capabilities, right? Well, believe it or not, the designers actually put in a failsafe for this. At the end, you go back to your ship and set the self-destruct mechanism, and then you beam back to the Goliath in order to win the game. If you install the warp drive right away when you first beam aboard the Goliath, that's it, game's done. And you'd think the game would do the predictable Sierra dick move thing and just kill you outright if you forgot to install the warp drive, but astonishingly, it actually shows a bit of mercy instead. If you miss the whole warp drive thing and beam back to the Goliath after setting your ship to self-destruct, the game actually puts you in the engine room again and gives you a chance to get this warp engine shit done before winning the game. It's kind of remarkable given that the game has no trouble just outright murdering you if you forget other crucial items in the game like WD-40's cloaking device or the canisters of liquid nitrogen at the lab, but in this case, I guess they just felt that killing the player right as they were about to finish the game was a step too far. Number 10. The Duracell Bunny, Space Quest 4. So we all know the Space Quest games likes its parodies. Monolith Burger is an obvious parody of McDonald's, complete with the curvy M that I honestly don't know how they got away with. What? There's a Droids R Us in Space Quest 1 that's a parody of Toys R Us. Oh no! And in the floppy version of Space Quest 4, Roger visits an electronics store named Radio Shack, which is a parody of the Radio Shack franchise. Some of these got changed in later revisions of the games, and people always assume it's because Sierra got sued by these companies and were forced to change them. Droids R Us became Droid B Us, and Radio Shack became Hertz So Good in the CD-ROM version, and the two guys from Andromeda actually leaned heavily into this idea that they got sued left and right. The current Inside Copy mockumentary that was included on the Space Quest Collection CD-ROM has this running gag where a company lawyer named Apollonia Jones, played by Sierra writer Leslie Balfour, starts rattling off a list of companies that Sierra were supposedly sued by.
There have been lawsuits then?
Oh yes. Oh yes. Let's see, ZZ Top sued us first. That got me my first beamer. Toys R Us, beamer number 2. Everready, was that Duracell? You know, one time Ken Williams himself sued us, but when we countersued with an abusive process, the whole thing got thrown out of court.
There's even this secret room in Space Quest 4 called the Room Removed for Legal Reasons, which is completely inaccessible in the game, but can be viewed in the resource files. It includes a bunch of the supposed legal threats that the Space Quest series received, and even a rendition of Earl Sinclair from the TV series Dinosaurs, which doesn't even appear in any Space Quest games whatsoever, but was actually an Easter egg in the VGA remake of Quest for Glory 1. The thing is, though, Sierra never actually got sued by any of these companies. Sure, they got the occasional cease and desist requests, like in the case of ZZ Top performing in the Corona Bar in Space Quest 1, but they never got outright sued by anyone. All of these changes to the parodies in Space Quest were actually done to prevent the off chance that they might get sued because, and this is true, Sierra never bothered to ask any of these companies if it was alright to parody them. They just did it and figured it was a case of, let's just do it and apologize later. But one such parody is special, and it has to do with the bunny you find walking around on the streets of Xenon in Space Quest 12. Now, you look at this thing and you think to yourself, hey, that's the bunny from that battery company. And Sierra's legal team must have gotten spooked or something, because for once they actually got in touch with the company and asked for permission to do the parody. Except they got in touch with the wrong company. See, in North America, the bunny mascot is owned by Everready, but everywhere else in the world, it's owned by Duracell. And guess which company the Sierra legal department reached out to? Yeah, they called Duracell and asked if it was okay to use their bunny. And Duracell just trolled the fuck out of them. They didn't mention that they didn't actually own the bunny mascot in North America, so they just said, sure, use the bunny. In fact, according to legend, that was the exact wording they got back from Duracell, use the bunny. And then Duracell probably pissed themselves laughing because they knew they had no reason to sue Sierra over that bunny because they had absolutely no right to. Yeah, sure, let them use the bunny. Let's see what Everready has to say about this. Joke's on them though, because Everready never noticed or didn't give a fuck, so the bunny remains in the game to this very day in all versions of Space Quest 4, ready to be snatched by Roger and robbed of its power pellet, which I thought was a hilarious joke because, you know, rabbit shit is called pellets, so, you know, poop jokes are always funny. Number 11, getting ZZ Top back on stage, Space Quest 1 Remake. But speaking of things that almost got the two guys in trouble, let's go back to that ZZ Top thing for a moment. Somehow, ZZ Top's lawyers got wind that their clients made an unexpected cameo in a little sci-fi comedy game, and they actually did send a cease and desist letter to Sierra. Now, the time frame is a little unclear here, but it seems to have happened sometime right after the remake of Space Quest 1 was released in 1991. The first version of the remake does indeed include some very true-to-life likenesses of the bearded gents from ZZ Top, but later releases of the remake have these little tiny dudes instead. And actually, the tiny little dudes are the ZZ Top guys, just resized down to pint versions of themselves, disguising them just enough to escape the threat of litigation and saving Sierra's art department from having to draw entirely new sprites. What few people know is that the original full-size sprites are still in the game, they were just replaced with a couple of patch files. See, SCI games, as in games that run on Sierra's SCI engine, have a very clever way of patching games. Instead of replacing the entire executable or resource file, Sierra programmers and artists could just put these little patch files in the game's directories, which would effectively override whatever was in the game's original code or resource file. And this saved massively on disk space, which meant that instead of recompiling the entire game, Sierra could just put these little patches on a floppy disk and instruct players to put them in the game's directory. Done. What this also means, though, is that if you delete these patch files, the game will revert back to using whatever's in the original resource file, and that's precisely what you can do with the Space Quest 1 remake. If you go into the game's folder on your hard drive and delete these two files, 433.v56 and 533.v56, then ZZ Top will appear in their normal size when you run the game. Pretty cool, huh? Take that, ZZ Top lawyers. Okay, that about does it for this video. Let me know what your favorite little anecdotes and interesting tidbits of the Space Quest series are, and see if you can surprise me down in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Bye!
Wow, je sens une légère érection de mes mamelons.